Hi, I'm Larry Magid, and welcome to Connect Safely Live, being simulcast on both Zoom and Facebook Live. Today's topic is something that's not very pleasant, but unfortunately something that is the reality for a certain percentage of our population, and we're very fortunate to have a leading expert in the field. The topic is domestic violence, and the reason we're bringing it in to these conversations is because during this period of sheltering at home, it's a particular problem for people who are affected by it because, among other things, they may not have an escape route. There may literally be nowhere else they can go. So I'm very pleased to introduce Rachel Gibson, who's the Senior Technology Safety Specialist at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And once again, I'm joined by my colleague, Kerry Gallagher, the K-12 Education Director for Connect Safely, also Assistant Principal for Learning at St. John's Prep School in Danvers, Massachusetts. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, welcome, Rachel. We're so glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, so Rachel, I want to start maybe just by talking a little bit about what the network does. NNEDV, I believe is what your initials are, why you exist, what you do, what services you offer, and then we'll get into some of the issues that are particularly on people's mind during this period.
Sure. So, hello, everyone. I bring you greetings from our new CEO and President, Deborah J. Vegans, and she sends her hellos. And the National Network to End Domestic Violence is a technical assistance provider, and we provide assistance to the 56 state and territorial domestic violence and dual domestic violence, sexual violence coalitions. And so we were founded as a policy shop where we, right as the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was signed in 1994, we were hearing from coalitions that we needed to have a presence in DC. And so out of that need, birthed our organization. And so our top priority is serving our 56 state and territorial coalitions through providing them technical assistance around domestic violence, around transitional housing. My team specifically provides technical assistance around the intersection of intimate partner violence and technology. We have an HIV/AIDS intersection project. And so we provide resources, trainings, and aid in that manner. The other big thing that we do, which has connected us with Connect Safely, is that we work with a lot of major technology companies to provide feedback and to provide support and guidance around policy making, around how their products work. And so we do a lot of that guidance to technology companies, as well as policy makers around statutes and law. So that's a little bit about our work.
Well, this sounds like a very basic question, but what is domestic violence? Because I know it's a little more than maybe people think it is.
Yeah, so I think when we think about domestic violence, it's rooted in power and control. One person exerting power and control over another person. So what are some signs of what that could be? Most often than not, people are going to think about physical violence. So bruises and hitting and scratching, those sorts of things. But there's also emotional abuse. There's also psychological. For communities of color, you might see religious abuse, where if a survivor is very devout and they are not following what their spouse says, then they will be reported to their priest or to their religious leader. Thinking about technology misuse and abuse. So an abusive partner may be monitoring them, stalking them, tracking them through their devices. So domestic violence can look like a lot of things. It can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And then thinking about not only just domestic violence, but stalking, dating violence, where maybe I have an intimate partner, but we don't live together. Or we see a lot of dating violence happening with young adults or teenagers. When we think about human trafficking, where people are being trafficked for money or sex, that sort of thing. So this violence can have a lot of different, it can look differently depending on what that person is experiencing. But that's generally a general overview of what domestic violence is. It's any type of action or behavior where someone is trying to exert power and control over someone in a often illegal way.
Thank you for that definition. I think that that's really important that, like you said at the beginning of your answer, when people think of domestic violence, they think of kind of the Lifetime movie version that is seen so often, but it really is that power dynamic. One of the reasons that we've been doing these live broadcasts is because of our new reality of working from home and, you know, people wanting to share information with each other in lots of new ways. And so I think that also means that there are new ways that people are exerting power over one another. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how the reality that we're living in right now is, you know, impacting what domestic violence looks like.
Sure. So I think I think people are really fixated on the idea that the pandemic is creating the violence. Whether or not there was a pandemic, violence was happening. I often say in my trainings that this is just old behaviors, new tactics. And so we're seeing abusive partners use new tactics. So this pandemic is a great way for someone to try to exert that power and control, because often than not, like in my state, we have a shelter or a stay at home order. So I can't really leave unless it's for essential things. So using that to make someone not be able to leave. Using, for instance, because a lot of people are living in unsure times, job security, health security is there. And so we see where those sorts of things may heighten people's reaction or heighten abuse because of those things. But even if, like I said, the pandemic was there, we see an influx of abuse happening when hurricanes come. We see an influx when the Super Bowl is in your city. And so it's less about the event, but more about what that event triggers for abusive partners or may bring to the forefront in a survivor's life.
During this period, I imagine your operations are affected. Certainly shelters are probably having issues that they wouldn't have had before. But let's talk about what are the problems that you're having to overcome. But more importantly, how are you overcoming them? What are the digital solutions that you're offering? And where can people reach out even if they can't leave their home?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Our director, Erica Olson, and some of my teammates in their wisdom, we were creating digital service toolkits for our agencies last year, just because we were hearing people slowly wanting to use chat or text or hotlines. And so we created these great tools and resources, not realizing that in a few short months, everybody would be moving to creating digital services. And so we're seeing our programs really have to shift how they do their advocacy. And I think it really is, it's less about, again, we're rooted in the core of our work, which is being survivor-centered, which is empowering survivors, but then it's shifting how we do that. And so we're seeing programs create chat, text, and video lines, doing video advocacy, video therapy, doing checking in digitally. And so a lot of our programs are doing that. And then it's also talking about the fact that even if we are going to be doing digital services, that we still have an obligation. Many of our programs, I won't say all, but many of our programs are funded federally to provide these services. And with that federal dollar comes federal confidentiality obligations. And so programs are not only thinking about the fact that I have to provide a chat line for someone now because they can't come into shelter maybe, but also thinking about, if I'm going to do a chat line, how do I do so with privacy and safety access, for accessibility and security in mind. And so our programs have done, I would say, a really good job. We get questions almost every day. Have you heard of the problems with Zoom? What about WebEx? What about this? What about that? So our programs are doing their due diligence to really figure out what is the best platform, what is the best way to communicate with survivors, and how do we do that well. So I commend all of the programs for really making that quick shift. And then thinking about too that a lot of programs have to make this shift with little to no increase in the funding that they receive. And so they're having to find almost free or low cost resources to do that. And so they're also relying heavily on our national programs and national partners. So survivors, if they can't call their local hotline, there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. There's one for the sexual assault, and there's one for men victims and children and youth, and a lot of different demographics. So there are hotlines and resources out there. We just have to make sure that survivors know that they're open. Your local domestic violence program is still open, still able to provide services, and reach out to them.
Rachel, kind of a follow-up question to that. If I think about security for me, I worry about hackers that are somewhere else in the world. But if you're a domestic violence survivor, you need to worry about security within the house.
Exactly.
And so when someone's reaching out, for example, I know sometimes it's better to reach out digitally rather than by phone because the person can't hear you. But there must be a concern when, however you're communicating, that the abuser is going to somehow stand behind you and see what you're writing or hear you if you're talking on the phone.
Exactly. And I think that comes to thinking about alternative ways to safety plan. And so what are some alternative ways that survivors can do that? So if I'm concerned that my abuser may hear me, then the National Domestic Violence Hotline has a chat and a text line. So texting might be an option. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that there's going to be a risk to whatever tool I use. So even if I maybe I don't have the risk of someone overhearing me, but my partner has put stalkerware on my device or some sort of monitoring, or my partner knows my password to my phone, so he could just pick it up and look and see who I'm talking to. So there is still risks with that, but it's thinking about how do we safety plan in a different way. So it could also be that I know some survivors are reaching out to bystanders. I think this is a really great time for bystanders to step up and really figure out how they support survivors. So for example, if my only one stop I can go to is the grocery store, maybe the grocery store worker may notice something and they can maybe say, hey, if it's safe, there's a hotline, or whatever the case may be. Or friends and family. My girlfriends from college and I do a Zoom happy hour once a month, and we check in with each other, and I maybe could use that tool to communicate with my friends. And so it really does require bystanders, friends, family members, our coworkers to really kind of step up and be that open line of communication for survivors and support survivors in that way. And so it's thinking of how of different ways to do it. It's also too for survivors important to think about that maybe if I can't talk on the phone, we know that before COVID happened, there were thousands of survivors who just don't even have access to phones, don't have access to the internet. Survivors living with disabilities may not be able to utilize chat lines because it may not be compatible with their screen reader. It may not be compatible with the devices that they're using. Maybe they have a cognitive disability and they may not be able to figure out how to download the app or whatever we're using. And so it's thinking about how do we still stay in touch? So for providers, some providers are actually using good old snail mail to send resources and send help. I know one program, they partnered with a school system who was handing out hot lunches, and that community collected pamphlets of all different types of services in their community, not just domestic violence, but they slipped the domestic violence pamphlets in there as a way to get the word out. So I think it really does mean that our community and survivors have to kind of think outside the box.
So that's a great transition to my next question, Rachel, and I love that you just talked about the community that partnered with the food collection for families. The district where I live, where my children go to school, they provide free breakfast and lunch to 100% of the students. And so there are 4 different locations around our city where food can be picked up once per day. It's lunch and then breakfast for the next morning. So I really love that idea. It's creative and it's thoughtful, and it really gets the information into the hands of people who, like you said, may not be able to access it online. What are some other ways, if while I was at a grocery store, I saw someone that I knew and they gave me a signal or said something to me that was essentially asking for help, what would be some steps that I could take as a person to really make sure that I was connecting that person with resources and following up, right? In that moment, I think for someone who has been a bystander, maybe a little bit of a shock to receive that information, and they may not know what to do in the moment. But I think we can forgive ourselves for feeling that shock and not knowing what to say right away. But what can we do moments later once we've had a chance to collect ourselves? What are some strategies that we can use?
Yes, and I think that's a great question. And I think first and foremost, assess if it's safe, right? So while we know that sometimes, and I don't have the statistic, but bystanders often get injured and hurt during these sort of situations. So first and foremost, assess the safetiness of that situation. But then it's also, believing the survivor. I think one of the biggest barriers that survivors have to getting service is the people in their life don't believe them, or they don't believe that what could be happening. So the first step is start by believing and assess for safety. I think the other thing though is too to say, I don't know who you should contact, but I know you should contact someone. Can I maybe give you the hotline information, or can I look it up on my phone? Maybe while you're standing in line, you're looking up the hotlines information and say, okay, can you write it down? Maybe on the back of the receipt discreetly, or maybe it's I can call them for you on my phone and you can talk to them. So it's really kind of thinking through some of those things, and I think really people are afraid to engage because they maybe fear that they don't know what to do, or they may be afraid that they may mess it up. But again, it's really making sure that the survivor is leading that conversation. I've been in situations where just out and about and I've seen something happen and a survivor has said, no, don't call 911. Don't call 911 because it could escalate the violence for me. It could also mean that the breadwinner in my home will go to jail. And then now we don't have money coming in. And so it's really listening to that survivor and letting them take the lead on deciding what's the best thing for them. And unfortunately, one of the things we train our hotline staff to think about is sometimes there's not going to be a resolution. And you're not going to know what happens, but all we can do is support survivors and give them the resources and let them decide for themselves.
I really love what you said about believing the survivor. I think in order for a survivor to say something, there has been a tremendous amount of thinking and emotion and courage that's gone into that statement. So it's really important for us to believe them in that moment. And I also love that the solution that you gave is writing a number on the back of a receipt. Like very, very simple things can make a huge difference. And I think that really provides some tools to our viewers here that are, you don't have to solve the problem for the survivor. You just have to believe them and let them know that they've been heard. So thanks for that. I appreciate that.
Rachel, I'm sorry, did you want to follow up on that, Rachel?
No, I was just going to say too, and I think the believing part is the biggest piece too, because this may be the one and only time that survivor can reach out for help. And if this is going to be that one and only time, and they see that their community doesn't believe them, the police doesn't believe them, especially when you talk about institutional racism and oppression, and when you talk about income inequality, and that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But if you think about how all of that stuff kind of plays into this, it's a bigger thing. And so if this is the one time that a survivor could reach out to someone and we don't believe them, it could be detrimental for that person. So we really do have to start by believing.
Thank you for that. You mentioned earlier that abuse isn't necessarily physical. It can be physical, it can be emotional, and of course it can be digital. So you may be in a situation where you're stuck in your home and you have a partner who may be stuck in his or her home, yet they are still able to reach you through the internet. The internet's great, we're using it right now, but it can also be used for harm. So talk a little bit about sort of the broader issue of emotional abuse and the specific issue of digital abuse.
Yes, well, that is my expertise because I work on our safety net team. And so I could talk about that for days. But I think it really starts about, again, it's still rooted in power and control. And the internet is just one tool that is being misused, or an app or device is one tool being misused in the broader scheme of what that person is going through. But I always think about it like the internet, social media reminds me of the city of New York, where they say that New York doesn't sleep, right? And that's kind of how I think about this in terms of what someone may experience in terms of abuse, where especially if you think about cyberbullying, where, you know, I may interact with the person in regular life, and then I can go home and maybe have some reprieve, but the things on the internet are constantly going, and that abuse may be constantly going. And so I think it's important to, especially with tech, I'm reiterating my last point, which is start by believing, because oftentimes survivors who are experiencing tech facilitated abuse, they'll tell somebody, well, for example, I worked with a survivor a couple weeks ago, and her intimate partner no longer lived in the home, but still had access to their Alexa accounts and was dropping in with Alexa and turning music on, or threatening through Alexa. And so it's those things where people think, oh, that's like 2044, that's so far away, but these things are happening. And so it really is that believing feature. And then thinking about how someone who may be experiencing online harassment, it doesn't just, it can be very scary for someone to not know where that's coming from. How do I get this taken down? I know for me, as a college student, there was a website that people posted some really mean, nasty things, and I got it taken down. But then I went a couple of years later to get a background check and had to do a polygraph check. And I was going to intern for the federal government. And one of the biggest fears I had was that they were going to find that. So it's still about this thing that it's still causing, even for me now, it still causes me a little kind of fear that someone could see that and have access to it. And it's an exposure of someone that is different than other types of abuse that we see. So that's kind of some of the things we think about in terms of online harassment.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I have another question for you on a slightly different topic. As Larry mentioned, I serve as the assistant principal for teaching and learning at a school in the Boston area, and it happens to be an all-boys school. And I was wondering if you may kind of touch on the role of different genders in building both awareness and kind of caring for one another under these circumstances. I think when we're working with our boys at my school, we're always talking to them about how, you know, it's important for them to be open so that they can be a place of sort of comfort and support for others if it's needed, and that it's also their obligation to understand that because they're boys, there is kind of built into their society a little bit of an imbalance, right? And you mentioned the word power early on, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, yeah, and I definitely think there's a weird misconception out there that we can do this work without men. And I don't know where that came from, because when you think about the numbers of who is committing the crimes, you see higher rates of men. And not to say that intimate partner relationships, when you think about LGBTQ plus communities, so that's a little different. But I will say that proportionately than not, you see that happen. And so there's this idea that we can solve this problem without having everybody at the table. And we cannot engage, we cannot change, we cannot make changes without having men and male identified persons at the table. And so we have to do this together. So I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is to hold people accountable. Hold your friends accountable. I think people are more willing to say, oh, if I see someone being physically abused, I'm going to step in and stop them, which is great. But then where's that accountability when your friends tell a misogynistic joke or a racist joke, or may say or do things that are problematic in that nature? And so the accountability has to be across the board. And so it really is about accountability. And then it's also making sure that when we engage allies, that we allow for mistakes to happen. Nobody is perfect. No one woke up today and was the wokest or the most liberated or the most anti-oppressive, whatever. We all had to learn. And so I think we can allow for mistakes to happen and do it in a gracious way, but also remember that there's a difference between a mistake and a conscious decision that is made over and over again. And so how do we go from holding space for people to make mistakes, but also holding you accountable when you are choosing to do problematic behavior? And how do I hold you accountable through love sometimes, but also it might not feel good. And we have to be able to sit with that uncomfortability of not feeling good when we make those mistakes. So those are just some of the quick things I can think of.
You know, the one male in this conversation, I want to thank you for, in a sense, the forgiveness, understanding, whatever it is, because we evolve. I mean, if I were to go back my entire lifetime to my childhood, I can think of things that I may have done that I wouldn't do today. And part of that is the personal evolution, part of that is the social evolution that we go through as a society. We live and we learn, and we adapt in positive ways. We evolve, hopefully. There are projects like the Good Men Project, for example, that talk to men. And I do think that, I'm glad you raised that issue, that we all have a responsibility to counter when we see things that are inappropriate, whether that's racial or gender remarks or homophobia or remarks about people with disabilities. I'll give you an example. I used to use the word gypped. It was just part of my vocabulary. Yeah. I now know that that's a derogatory term for gypsies. So I don't use it anymore. I had no idea until someone at some point, I don't know how many years ago, pointed that out to me. And there's many things in our vocabulary that we need to think about. But more important, we need to be allies. We need to support people. If we're fortunate enough that we don't have these issues in our own lives, we need to certainly support those who do. I want to transition for a moment. We've talked a little bit about digital abuse, and we talked about digital cyberbullying, but there's also, as you pointed out, the possibility that your abuser might have access to your password, to your device, to your account. What can you do to try to protect your devices to make sure that they're not being used against you or your accounts?
Yes, and I think that's a really great question. And I just was saying about my own intimate partner, one of the things that I love about my intimate partner is that they know my date of birth. They know my favorite color. They know my mother's maiden name. They know all of these things about me because they're my intimate partner. But those are typically like the security questions that so we all fill out when we get locked out of our account repetitively. And so I think it's important to remind people that intimate partners tend to have access to an unprecedented amount of information just for the nature of who they are in our lives. And so I think first and foremost, when you want to identify what's happening is think about what that person knows about you. If I'm here in my home and my intimate partner is not here, and he comes back home and says, "Oh, I see you were having a conversation with Larry Magid at Connect Safely today at approximately 1 p.m. Eastern time," right? Like, how would my intimate partner know that? That can give me some clues to indicate maybe there's a camera in my home, maybe there's stalkerware on my device. So I think it's really you have to choose the path, and the path might change, but it's really starting by identifying what's happening and what that person knows. I think the other piece, and I see you may have a question to that. I think the other piece too, though, is your first line of defense is a password. One of the things I think about is I don't leave my doors unlocked. I don't leave my windows unlocked. I put a lock on the door, and the lock for your devices is your password. That is the key to your digital home. And so making sure you have a password if it's safe for you to do so. And I want to make sure it's important for your listeners to know that all of these tools and strategies that I give may not be safe for certain survivors, but they can consider it and figure out what works best for them. But a password, and then changing that password. So again, it's thinking about, for me, I like to use phrases that I know, but then change them up, add maybe a letter in there or a number or a special character. So password safety is key. And then I think one of the biggest pieces of this is documenting what's happening. So find a safe place to maybe write down or store what's happening. Is your computer shutting down irregularly? Or does someone know the nature of your phone calls? Can someone see what you're posting? So documenting is going to be important, especially if, for instance, you want that, whatever it is, maybe it's a social media post, taken down. So document what's happening first and then report to the social media company, because then it may be taken down and you may not have access to it later. So making sure that you document the date, the time, what exactly is happening. If a cell phone maybe was used, did you see it on your cell phone, but maybe not on your computer? Was there a clicking noise happening in the background? Kind of give an idea of what will paint that picture. And then lastly, I think it's really just survivors need to trust their instincts. They're the experts in their lives. They know their abuser best. So trust your instinct and figure out ways that they can try to minimize some of this and think about safety strategies.
You mentioned passwords, and I want to point out that at ConnectSafely.org/passwords, we have some advice, and it includes the idea of a very long phrase. The longer, the better, within certain reasons. But it does bring up the issue of the fact that if your abuser is living with you or is in your home, they may have physical access to your phone or your other devices. I mean, it's pretty hard to guard your phone 24/7. You could be sleeping. He or she could get up in the middle of the night and put some spyware on it. What's your advice there?
Yeah, and I think in that situation too, it's really important for survivors to be careful, because any sort of shift or change could indicate to the abusive partner that they are being found out. And so it's, if I notice that maybe something's really weird happening on my device, or I think I'm being monitored, maybe it's, I don't go on the domestic violence webpage on my phone, but I don't think that they've had access to my computer because it's my work laptop. And so maybe I go on my work laptop. That's not to say that I don't still use that other device, because maybe I don't want to indicate to the abusive partner that something's happened, but it is thinking about how do I use my technology strategically. And then again, it's also thinking about who can I use, or what can I use to alternative safety plan. So one woman reported that she played Words with Friends with her sister and used the chat feature in Words with Friends to communicate that she needed help. And the abusive partner was looking for text messages, was looking for phone calls, but didn't even think to check Words with Friends. So it's using those kind of tools at our fingertips to make them work for us, to make them to figure out how we can use that to kind of either get help or document or anything like that.
I think that's brilliant. And even opportunities to share like screenshots with somebody through those other methods that are not kind of the typical,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Pardon the dog barking in the background. We're getting a delivery. We're all working from home here, right? So one question I have for you is, if some of our listeners are worried and are ready to seek out help, and they're not sure what's available in their community, what could they go to online now for your organization that's kind of broader to help them kind of drill down? Where could they go?
So we have our NNEDV.org website, a COVID response page that has a lot of good resources. My team also, because we were hearing from a lot of survivors that they just didn't even know where to start, we created a document that lists all, or not all, but a lot of the national hotlines around abuse. And that's at TechSafety.org. And I believe it's /COVID-19. If not, I can actually pull it up and make sure you all get access to that and you can share it with your readers. But I think that's a really good starting point, is to figure out the resources. So maybe you don't know your local resources, but your national level resources are going to be a great start. They're trained advocates and can help you figure out who locally you can reach out to. So I would start there. There's also, like I said, the National Domestic Violence Hotline has a list of resources. There's RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network is another good one. There's tons and tons of resources out there. And like I said, I can share with you all that list that we have. And they offer, the other thing that I love that we talked about earlier is they offer, a lot of these resources are offered through a chat a text or a phone line. And I know that the National DV hotline has a Spanish speaking chat as well. There's also for survivors with disabilities, you may be able to, there's a video option, I think that the DV hotline runs in connection with a national disability service provider. So there are resources out there. We just got to get them to you, and we can definitely make sure we get that to you.
And Rachel, if you get us a list and links, we can put those on our website as well to refer
Perfect.
to your organization and others. Rachel, thank you so much. Rachel Gibson from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. As usual, thank you to my colleague, Kerry Gallagher, for the great contribution to this event. Please join us every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. This coming Thursday, day after tomorrow, we're going to be talking with an executive of Zoom, the very technology that we're using
I
to create
have to
this.
that one.
Yeah, about how to stay safe on Zoom and how to maximize your Zoom experience. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all on Thursday.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you all for having me.